In the 1800s, every woman who approached her delivery date made two sets of preparations. The first set was visible, the midwife engaged, the lying-in chamber prepared, the neighbour arranged to come when labour began, the physician's address written on a paper near the door. The attended delivery planned and ready, the support system assembled against the known event of childbirth arriving. The second set of preparations was quieter, made privately, passed between women in the specific way that women pass knowledge that the official record does not acknowledge, in letters, in whispered conversations on tenement staircases, in the commonplace books and household manuscripts that women kept alongside their recipes and household remedies. The preparation for the possibility that when labour began, nobody came. Not because women expected to deliver alone, because women were practical and the women who had come before them had been practical, and the accumulated practical knowledge of generations had established one clear truth about labour. It does not wait for convenient circumstances. The midwife delayed by another delivery across the parish, the physician unavailable, the husband at the factory with no mechanism by which to reach him, the neighbour not home, the snowstorm that closed the road between the farmhouse and the village, the domestic servant whose concealed pregnancy had not been arranged for, whose labour arrived before any plan had been made. If you were a Victorian or medieval woman approaching your delivery, you carried both sets of preparations simultaneously. The attended delivery you planned for and the unattended delivery you prepared for quietly, practically, without telling the physician who would have disapproved of the preparation because its existence implied a doubt about the reliability of his attendance. Before we continue, subscribe. Irvin Loudon, in his 1992 study Death in Childbirth, documented the specific mortality comparisons that make the second set of preparations more than a practical contingency. The finding that appears in multiple documented analyses of Victorian maternal mortality, that the women who delivered without physician attendance in the fever era survived at rates that should have restructured the entire debate about what professional attendance was actually providing, is at the end of this video. It did not restructure the debate. The medical establishment had reasons for that too. The women who prepared quietly and practically for the possibility of delivering alone were not preparing out of ignorance. They were preparing out of knowledge, specific accumulated passed woman to woman across centuries, and in measurable outcomes more reliable than what the official medical framework was offering in the specific decades when the fever was at its worst. What they prepared, how they used it, what they knew, that is what this video is about. The preparations began before labour, sometimes weeks before. The specific herbal preparations that medieval and Victorian women assembled in advance of their deliveries were not folk superstition operating outside the boundaries of effective medicine. They were documented, specific, and in several cases pharmacologically active, compounds whose mechanisms modern pharmacology has since confirmed passed between women across generations in the recipe collections, commonplace books, and household manuscripts that constitute the unofficial medical literature of women's reproductive experience. Raspberry leaf, dried, prepared as a tea, consumed in the final weeks of pregnancy. Its documented use in women's household manuscripts stretches back to the medieval period. The specific property attributed to it in women's accounts, the strengthening and toning of the uterine muscle in preparation for the contractions of labour. Modern pharmacological research has identified specific compounds in raspberry leaf that interact with uterine smooth muscle, not definitively, not without qualification, but sufficiently to explain why the women who used it across centuries reported the specific effects they documented. Shepherd's purse, the specific plant documented in Victorian women's correspondence as a preparation against postpartum bleeding. Its hemostatic properties, its capacity to reduce bleeding, are documented in the contemporary pharmacological literature as real and measurable. The women who prepared shepherd's purse in advance of their deliveries were not guessing. They were applying knowledge their mothers had given them that their mothers' mothers had given them, knowledge whose effectiveness was established in the outcome record of women who used it, rather than in the clinical trial record that did not exist for women's traditional preparations. Hilary Marland, in her 2004 study Dangerous Motherhood, documented the specific practical preparations that accompanied the herbal ones. The clean linen assembled and stored, the specific quantity, the specific preparation of it, the knotted rope tied to the bedpost, the specific object that gave a labouring woman something to pull against during contractions, a physical anchor that managed the pain and the effort of unattended delivery, with the specific practicality of a solution that required no equipment beyond a length of rope and a bedpost. The birthing stool or chair, the specific positioning aid that medieval and early Victorian women used to manage delivery in the upright or semi-upright position that gravity assists, and that the lying down position prescribed by Victorian medical manuals does not. The specific knowledge of positioning, documented in women's private letters and in the midwifery manuals that circulated outside official medical frameworks, was itself a form of practical obstetric knowledge that the physician-directed lying down delivery position was actively working against. The women who knew to position themselves upright, to use gravity, to move during labour rather than remain horizontal, were applying knowledge that modern obstetrics has returned to after spending a century and a half enforcing the physician-convenient lying down position. The knowledge was in the commonplace books, it was in the letters, it was passed woman to woman outside any institution across centuries. The medieval woman who delivered alone left records in the places medieval women's experiences appear: church documents, legal records, the occasional personal account preserved by accident rather than intention, and the coroner's inquest that was called when the delivery ended in a death that required official explanation. The medieval birth room, when it functioned as intended, was a specific and carefully managed female space. The lying-in chamber sealed against cold air and male presence, the female community assembled, the midwife, the neighbours, the experienced older women of the parish whose knowledge of delivery was the community's accumulated practical obstetric resource. This was the ideal. The medieval birth room as the church and the community expected it to operate. What happened when the community was not available, when the labour arrived early, when the woman was isolated, when the parish midwife was at another delivery or unavailable, is documented in the specific cases that appear in medieval coroners' records across England. Clarissa Atkinson, in her 1991 study, The Oldest Vocation, documented the specific medieval understanding of what a woman should do when labour began without attendants. The specific prayers, not as magical thinking but as the specific psychological management of fear and pain that the medieval woman's entire framework provided. The prayers to St. Margaret of Antioch, whose specific patronage of women in labour was the medieval period's institutional acknowledgement that delivery was dangerous and that women needed specific divine protection during it. The girdle of St. Margaret, the specific relic belt documented as being passed between the women of a parish community for their deliveries, a physical object that carried the accumulated prayers and survivals of every woman who had worn it before, the medieval community's specific material inheritance of survived deliveries. The cases in the coroner's records are specific and consistent. A woman whose labour began in a field during harvest, the specific season when every able-bodied person was at work, when the farm's domestic routines were suspended in favour of the harvest requirements, when a woman's labour arriving between the crop rows was an event that the harvest's economics did not pause for. The medieval accounts of women who delivered in barns, in outhouses, in the spaces between the domestic and the agricultural, where medieval working-class women spent their working days. The specific outcomes documented in these records are not uniformly tragic. Women survived unattended medieval deliveries with a frequency that the coroner's record, which documented deaths rather than survivals, systematically underrepresents. The survival was ordinary, the death was recorded. The specific woman who delivered alone in the harvest field and then returned to work, her survival not recorded because survival required no official documentation. Her delivery not noted because an unattended delivery that ended well was, in the medieval working-class community, a sufficiently ordinary event to require no record. The record we have is the record of the deaths. The survivals were the majority. They simply were not written down. The Victorian woman who delivered alone was most likely young, working class and urban. The specific circumstances that produced unattended Victorian deliveries were not primarily the rural isolation of the farmhouse 3 miles from the nearest midwife, though that circumstance produced its share of documented unattended deliveries. The more common Victorian circumstance was urban and specific. The working-class tenement building in which every adult in the household was at work when labour began, in which the neighbours who would ordinarily have helped were also at work, in which the midwife who had been engaged could not be reached, because the husband who would have gone for her was at the factory and the wife who needed her was already in labour alone. Ellen Ross, in her 1993 study Love and Toil, documented the specific domestic geography of Victorian working-class life that made the unattended delivery not rare but regular. The household stripped of its adults during the working day. The woman who felt the first contractions in the morning after her husband had left for work and before her neighbour had returned from hers. The specific window of the working day in which Victorian working-class women were most likely to find themselves in labour without immediate access to any of the help they had arranged. The survival strategies documented in Victorian women's private correspondence are specific and practical. A letter between two women in the 1860s, preserved in a private collection and documented in the social history literature, describes in specific terms what one woman told another to do if labour progressed faster than help could arrive. The positioning, the breathing management, the specific management of the cord after delivery, the instruction not to cut it without a clean instrument and clean hands, the specific instruction to tie it tightly in two places before cutting, the specific knowledge of when it was safe to cut and when it was not. The management of the placenta, documented in women's correspondence as the specific stage of an unattended delivery that most required knowledge and most frequently went wrong without it. The specific instruction to allow the placenta to deliver naturally rather than pulling at the cord. The specific knowledge that pulling the cord before the placenta had separated was the specific action most likely to produce the hemorrhage that killed women in unattended deliveries when it went wrong. These instructions were not available in the official medical literature in a form accessible to working-class Victorian women. They were available in the letters between women, in the conversations on tenement staircases, in the specific accumulated knowledge of the women who had delivered before and knew what the next woman needed to know. The knowledge was practical, specific, and effective. It was also entirely outside the framework of official Victorian medicine, which is why the official record does not contain it, and why the women who held it understood that the knowledge was theirs to keep and pass on, not to surrender to the institution that had not earned their trust. The finding appears in Irvin Loudon's Death in Childbirth and in multiple other documented analyses of Victorian maternal mortality, and it has never been fully explained away by the medical historians who have encountered it. In the fever era, the decades before Semmelweis's hand-washing proof was adopted, before antiseptic practice reached obstetrics, before the 1880s when Lister's protocols began to change what happened in delivery rooms, the mortality comparison between different types of delivery attendants produced a result that the medical establishment's advocacy for physician attendants cannot comfortably accommodate.
Push now, deep breath and push.
Women delivered at home by experienced midwives, mortality approximately 1 in 200. Women delivered at home by physicians, mortality significantly higher than midwife-attended home deliveries in the documented fever era analyses. Women delivered alone or with only unqualified female attendants, mortality in multiple documented analyses lower than physician-attended home deliveries during the same period. The mechanism is the same mechanism that killed women in the lying in hospitals. The physician who came to the Victorian home delivery came from other patients, from other cases, from the same transmission pathway that the anatomy room and the delivery ward created in the hospital setting. He came to the working-class woman's tenement room from the case he had attended before, with the same hands, the same frock coat, the same unwashed transmission pathway that Semmelweis had proved lethal in 1847, and that the medical establishment had declined to act on for 30 years. The woman who delivered alone was not exposed to that pathway. The woman attended by an experienced midwife who had not come from an anatomy room or a fever case was not exposed to it. The woman who had the most professional attendance, the physician, was the woman most likely to receive the infection that his professional movement between cases made him the most likely carrier of. Pat Jalland, in her 1996 study Death in the Victorian Family, documented the specific institutional response to the mortality comparison when it appeared in the analyses of the period. The response was not to revise the advocacy for physician attendance. The advocacy for physician attendance was simultaneously an advocacy for physician authority over the birthing room. The professional territorial claim that had been displacing the midwife from the Victorian delivery room across the century. That territorial claim was not negotiable. The mortality numbers that suggested the territory should be returned were filed in the same administrative category as every other inconvenient finding that the Victorian medical establishment encountered and did not act on. The women delivering alone in their tenement rooms, the women the establishment most worried about, the women most frequently described in official publications as being at risk from the absence of professional attendance, were in specific documented periods of the fever era surviving at rates that the physician's attendance was not matching. The finding was available, the practice did not change, the authority was not negotiable. What the women who delivered alone knew can be measured in the outcome record that the official medical history spent 3 centuries trying not to look at directly. The accumulated knowledge, herbal, practical, positional, communal, that women passed to each other across medieval and Victorian England outside any official framework was not an inferior substitute for professional medical attendance. In the specific historical circumstances of the fever era, it was a safer alternative to the most dangerous form of professional attendance available. The physician who moved between cases without washing his hands because the medical establishment had decided that the proof requiring him to wash them was not credible. The women who prepared raspberry leaf and shepherd's purse and knotted ropes to bedposts were not practicing superstition. They were applying pharmacologically active compounds and mechanically sound positional strategies whose effectiveness is documented in the outcome record of the women who used them. The knowledge was not perfect. Unattended delivery carried real risks that professional attendance, had it been safe, could have reduced. But the knowledge was real, it was specific, and it was the product of accumulated female experience across generations that no institution had organised, no physician had endorsed, and no official record had preserved, because the knowledge was passed between women and the official record was kept by men. The commonplace books survive in fragments, the letters survive in private collections, the specific instructions, the positioning, the herbal preparations, the management of the cord and the placenta, the specific knowledge of when to wait and when to act, survive in the scattered documentary record of women's private communication across centuries. The women who passed this knowledge to each other did not know they were documenting a form of obstetric practice that would eventually be validated by the mortality comparisons of historical epidemiology. They were doing what women have always done with knowledge that the institutions of their time did not value. They were keeping it alive in the only medium available to them, which was each other. The verdict is not complicated. The women who delivered alone, equipped with what their mothers and neighbours had taught them, survived their deliveries in the fever era at rates that the medical establishment's most credentialed practitioners were not matching. The knowledge that produced those survival rates was not in any medical journal. It was in the letters between women. It was on the tenement staircases. It was in the commonplace books that nobody archived because nobody thought they contained anything worth preserving. They contained everything worth preserving. The women who kept them knew that. The women who received them knew that. The institution that spent 3 centuries replacing them with something less effective did not know it, or did not want to.